So what I'm going to go through tonight, and if anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask as we go along, and I can always tell you we're going to cover it later if it comes to that. The three main areas I'm going to cover is a little bit about background in terms of astro for me, what I mean by astro, what I mean by nightscape, the types of nightscape and the likes. But the majority of the session's actually going to be on planning. I'll break that down into desktop planning, mobile apps, so I can kind of share with people how I go about that. And then if you actually go and do a recce as well. So they're the three main types of planning that I do, certainly. And then shooting. So obviously there's the basic settings, but I'll go into the different types of images and nightscapes that I like to shoot and give people a few ideas about settings. I'm not planning to go into post-processing tonight because that could take an hour and a half on its own. And certainly for me, as I'll come back to talk about, planning is definitely the biggest amount of effort that goes into all of these kind of shots. So I thought it was worthwhile covering those kind of things in particular. So without further ado, in terms of what astro or nightscape means to me and what it doesn't mean to me, is it doesn't mean nightscapes, deep space astro. I love that kind of stuff, but for me, I'm starting to call my astro nightscapes because it's got more akin to nighttime landscapes than anything else. So when I talk about astro, I actually mean nightscapes as opposed to deep space stuff. For me, why do I do it? Well, actually, it's about the whole experience. So it's not just about coming away with an image that I've captured. When I do nightscapes nowadays, quite often it's an all-nighter, and I'm getting older, so that's definitely getting harder and harder to do. But even when I took May, so May, I took a few of the girls out and did some training with them. I don't know if it was last year or the year before. It might have been a couple of years ago. We went to Dunnottar Castle. We all pulled an all-nighter because effectively you want to be able to get the best of what's there to offer. And in the images that you can see here, for example, actually sitting after twilight has gone, as an astrological twilight has gone, waiting for the sunrise, there's almost something rather zen about it. So I'm not really into meditation or any of that kind of stuff, but I do find two things are true with astro for me. One is that effectively you suddenly feel so small in this huge expanse of the world, and it can put all of your own problems into perspective. So I find it quite therapeutic. And then the other thing is just sitting there waiting for sunrise and watching the beauty of the world without trying to capture it is something really special to me. So so for me, that's why I do it. And if I get a good picture out the back of it, then so much the better. But it's not as much about the experience and the solitude as it is about the images. So variations and kit, they're the other things I'm going to very quickly cover when we get there. So types of nightscape. For me, it's expanded a lot. So originally, astro for me meant Milky Way, and it always had to include the Milky Way, otherwise it didn't feel like it was astro. But over the time, I've realised that I can actually appreciate a starry night almost as much as a Milky Way shot. But they're the more typical pictures when people talk about nightscapes, and astro is Milky Way. Actually, I've also started to really get into twilight and moonrise. And when we come and talk about planning, I'll explain a little bit more about why that is. But in essence, it just gives you so much more opportunity to take pictures. I had a friend last year did 100 Night Under the Stars. And she did that for Sony as a big project, and as she says, it was more like 100 nights under the clouds, because effectively getting a good night with clear skies and all of the things that have to come together, or the stars to align for you to get a really good nightscape, is really unusual, or at least it's not as frequent as you might like. So if you start thinking about twilight, moonrises, so the images I've got here, this one for example, it's a moonrise, and the moon was coming up just in between the mountain ranges here. If you look really closely, you can see there are stars in the sky, but it's actually a moonrise rather than an astro per se. And this one here is a mixture of moonrise and twilight. So when the timing comes together, it looks like a sunrise or a sunset, but with stars. Actually, it's not. It's the moonrise that's creating the colour in the cloud, and it tends to be that twilight look that gives you the most beautiful kind of magenta colours. So twilight and moonrise is another variation that I'm now getting into. I can't talk about nightscapes without touching aurora. I know we're lucky enough in Scotland to see a little bit of this. In fact, this image here was taken in Torridon. So I think my best astro aurora has actually been in Scotland. I've been to Iceland many, many times now. And I'll come back and talk about some of these images down here. But quite often it can be roaring so hard, but above the clouds, so that you can see movement, but you can't actually capture it. And you get to the stage where you may be that dogged and determined that you'll stay up just waiting for a hole in the clouds to capture something. So I'll talk a little bit about aurora and the type of settings that you need for that. Star trails. So star trails is something I really enjoy doing as well. We'll talk a little bit about it, but not to a huge degree. We can cover that if anyone's got any questions later. But star trails are either something you can shoot specifically for it, or if you're doing a long exposure for your foreground, you tend to get a small star trail anyway. So a lot of the time, some people will just leave the lens open to get a good star trail. And then last but not least, certainly in my definitions here, there's also time lapse. So effectively, for now, I've really got the bug of taking time lapses because it gives you the opportunity of having a time lapse, a star trail, or indeed that final image. So we'll talk a bit about that too. So they're the different types of nightscape that I mean when I talk about the things that I enjoy doing and that I'll touch on tonight. Equipment, what do you need? You don't actually need a lot. I think people think you need better kit than you actually do. I'll show some pictures that have been taken with an f4 lens, even though most of my lenses are f2.8. But in essence, all you need is a camera or some kind of device that can handle low light conditions. You even get mobile phones now that are good enough, and some apps that means you can start taking the night sky. Lenses, as I say, f2.8 or wider aperture is ideal for night skies, but you can take them on any others. You do need a tripod. That's probably the one thing that you need, because you're like to be having your shutter open for quite some time, even from 6 seconds upwards to 20 or 30 seconds, depending on what you're doing. And then I've put here shutter remote and intervalometer. Well, they're kind of optional for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you can buy intervalometers and shutter remotes. A lot of cameras nowadays have them built in. So certainly when I went on to my second body, I bought that. I actually upgraded my Canon 5D Mark III to Mark IV explicitly because I wanted the inbuilt intervalometer, because I'd had so many times when my external one failed on me. But you only actually need those if you're going to try and do time lapses or star trails, because you can, as long as you can set a camera to do under 30 seconds, then you can take a good astro shot. So that's an optional one. So you don't need a lot. I find when I go out and do my night photography, I'm traveling light compared to when I go and do landscape, because you just need, for me, 2 bodies and 2 lenses, and that's it. You don't have to take all the other variety of lenses with you. You don't need filters or anything like that, although you can use special filters. I don't. Okay, so planning. I kind of mentioned 70-20-10 here because that's the ratio I tend to find I put into my night photography. It really is 70% of it, the work goes into planning, and the 20 and 10 are just very rough fingers in air, really. So 70% planning, 20% capturing, and 10% processing. If you have to spend a whole load of time processing, you're probably talking about digital art rather than photography. And or you didn't get it right in camera at the time. So that's the kind of ratios that I tend to look at. So for planning starts really early for me. And the reason for that is most of my photography to date at nighttime has been at new moon. It's been traditional Milky Way photography. And when you're talking about Milky Way in the UK, there's only so many months that you can do that in. So it tends to be March and April. And it's partway through March will be the first time the Milky Way is actually coming above the horizon for you to be able to capture it. You can potentially get something in August, but it doesn't tend to be particularly fruitful. And then you've got September, October, and November. So you've really got 5 months in the year. And if you're looking at doing Milky Way and you want to do it in a new moon, that normally gives me, because I tend to do it on a weekend because I'm pulling an all-nighter, it gives me 5 opportunities in a whole year. And in the UK, the weather doesn't tend to be all that great. So quite often, I think last year I got probably one good image, because most of the times I'd planned it, the weather just went against me. But if you're not worried about the Milky Way as much, then of course you can shoot all year round. So that's another reason why I've started to do more starry skies and twilights and things like that, because I want a whole range of options. But what I do at the beginning of the year is I go through and I set in my calendar all of the astro weekends that are the closest to the new moon, so that I can try and do something around them. So that's my first pass annual planning. The next thing that I guess less people tend to know about is compositional planning. So this, if it makes sense to people, I'll walk it through, effectively says from March to May, the Milky Way is going to be fairly horizontal. And it's actually going to be southeast. So when you start thinking about a composition, you need to think about what might be a good foreground looking in that southeasterly direction. And in particular, something that's going to work well with a horizontal type composition. If I just quickly say, when I first looked at this, I went and did some checking on my own photos, because I hadn't even realized it. But you can see here that, lo and behold, if I look at this photo was shot in April, yes, absolutely. It was a horizontal image. And one that I'd taken in September was a vertical image. And I hadn't even twigged that was the case. In the UK, actually, as I said, it's a bit of a wipeout in the summer, because A, it's too bright, and B, the Milky Way just does not rise above the horizon, so you can't capture it at all. You can capture it elsewhere, but maybe when it comes to that May to July, the summer period, that's when you might start doing more moonrises and other kind of astro. But for me, this was a bit of a revelation, and it certainly helped me with my desktop planning, that I could start working out just nominally what kind of areas I might like to go and see. So for example, March and April is great for Dunnottar, because that's looking out in a southeasterly direction. July to November, that's when Glencoe Lockwood worked well, or when I did my planning, I think I worked out that Balmoral and the Lone Tree could potentially work. So you start working out what's gonna work in certain times of the year. Moon planning. So the moon cycles, as I said, is fairly easy to say, well, you know when new moon is. But if you want to increase your chances of taking more photos, then looking at moonrise and moonset is really important, because actually you may well find, and I'll go into the apps a bit later on, you may well find that there's a period of time, although it's not a new moon, the moon's actually already set, so it's not as prominent in the sky. And if anyone wonders why I keep banging on about new moon being best, the only reason is it bleaches out the sky, so you can't see the stars as well. Whereas if it's as dark as it can possibly be, in astrological darkness, the darkest bit in the night, then obviously the star's going to be better. And then the twilight combo, what I mean by that is, if you work out when sunrise and sunset happens to coincide with moonrise or moonset, that's when you start getting those magical colours that I was talking about. So that doesn't happen as often, so you do need to sit down and plan out when that's going to be, or at least if you're as fixated on this type of thing as I am, then I take the time to do that. So effectively that allows you to optimize and have more chances for success. Conversely, I guess when I was first starting out, before I started to do moonrises and twilights, I like seascapes. So for me, if I typify the type of things I like to shoot in landscape, it tends to be water, it tends to be movement, it might be abstract, but it's definitely astro. So if I bring astro and seascapes into the equation, I've got to plan the tides in as well. So if you then start looking for a new moon with the right tide, your chances get smaller and smaller. So that's probably why I'm not quite so prolific in my astro images. It's probably also why once a year I go abroad, because I like to go to America has become a favourite, simply because you can shoot astro all the way through the summer, because they don't have the same problems as we do in this part of the world. near-term planning. So once you've done your desktop, you've got your annual calendar, you've worked out the compositions that you might like to do, and you've worked out when that's going to be. As you get closer and closer, you then need to make sure that the conditions are going to be right. And the type of things I'm obviously interested in most is it going to be cloudy? There's no point trying to photograph the stars if you can't see them. Is it going to be windy? And the reason the wind is important is if you're relying on reflections. So again, for me, I like to do reflections and water. As soon as you get a windy condition, then you're not going to be able to get that. Is it too cold? I spent a whole night sitting by the side of a Kyochern and did a whole load of time lapsing there. And the lock froze in front of my eyes. So I ended up having a couple of nice photos, but the time lapse that I spent all the time preparing for was pretty useless. And then the other thing on wind that I hadn't really considered is I'd gone and done a long recce with my son up in Glencoe to visit every different spot I could imagine, because most of the Glencoe locations don't actually lend themselves to astro compositions. It's facing the wrong direction for one. You can get the tail of the Milky Way, but I didn't know when that would be. So I spent a whole weekend hiking to every area I could imagine, and then took detailed notes of when would be good, what compositions would work, so that I could come back again. So, and we did come back. We came back, and it was actually my birthday weekend. Alex and I went and stayed at the King's House Hotel. We went out in the middle of the night to try and capture some of these things. And the one night that it was clear for about half an hour, about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, it was so windy that you wouldn't have been able to put your tripod up. So all of a sudden, wind suddenly comes into the equation for that as well. So well done, Scotland. That stymies you again. And then the last thing I've got here is obviously you can do all of the wonderful planning, but it could be that something else comes and means you can't get access anymore. Not just the coronavirus, but it could be that people are working in an area. It could be that the snow is so bad that they've closed the roads. There's all sorts of reasons why that long-term plan that you've waited a whole year to be able to go and do is no longer available to you. And I tend to drive quite some distances to try and capture the images that I want to. So I do need to be able to check that as I go along. So near-term planning is definitely something that I need to do there.
Vikki, that's just before 8 o'clock. So if you want to pause there,
perfect.
I'll have a quick.
This is very interesting, Vikki.
Good. I realised I was rattling through it quite quickly, so I could be finished quite early, in which case we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. But is it making sense?
It's really good, actually. Thanks.
Yeah.
Really good.
Quite a complicated subject, though.
Well, yeah, when I sat down and started working out what I wanted to cover, then yeah, you start disappearing into all sorts of rabbit holes, because for me, my journey has just evolved and extended and extended. Yeah. Once you start getting the things you enjoy doing down pat, which if anything is ever down pat, then you just start experimenting with other things, and it just grows and grows, which is actually really nice, because it now means that I don't have to just do 5 weekends a year, because last year was a bit of a dry year in terms of weather not being quite so dry and clear.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy it. I really enjoy it.
How long did it take you to get into it, Vikki?
Well, I think when I was looking at my photos to work out which ones I might want to use, the first one that I took was probably 2011. So I've been doing it for about 9 years.
Wow.
But it was kind of fits and starts. So the very first time was in Scotland when I wanted to go and try and catch the aurora. And half the time it's finding other people to go with you as well when you're first starting and don't know what you're doing. So I hooked up with a few people in the Edinburgh area, and we went out aurora hunting together, which is a bit bizarre because it's normally gentlemen you've almost never met and you're willing to get it in a car or drive to dark places with. And then we went to then my mum and I went to Iceland, and if we have time at the end, which I suspect we will now, I when I was going through my pictures, the hits versus the misses, so the fails, the amount of pictures that just didn't work out were so many. But the funniest one, I guess, was the first time I did catch the aurora, and that was out in Iceland. So I spent a lot of time reading up, figuring it all out. So I'm mainly self-taught. But now that I go on normally workshops every year, I normally twist the arm of whoever it is to go out and do some astro with me. And the one that I did this year specialised in astro. And my last year's adventure was also with one of my favourite astrophotographers. So you get to add to your repertoire and understand how you do things a little bit more every time you do that. But yeah, so I've been doing it for about 9 years, and I'd probably say it's been a key passion of mine for 5 or 6 now. And you know, even learning how to process them that little bit better. So yeah, it's a brand new world, and for me, the type of things that I love doing, what everyone's just kind of gathering still, is I ride motorbikes, I go scuba diving, and photography is my happy place. So there's obviously something about a different world. So being underwater, for example, is just being like in another planet, another realm. And I actually think astro is a little bit like that. So there's obviously something in me that quite likes a departure from the norm. Maybe it's escapism, I don't know. But yeah, it's really nice. And when you start finding other people enjoy it as well, then that can be great fun. So I've made a good set of friends now. We're going to Iceland again in December together. But there's some North Americans, some Canadians, and a New Zealand girl and me. So there's 5 of us, and we go out and we go on astro holidays together, which is great fun because not everyone wants to stay up all night.
Well, I think everyone's probably back by now, so if you want to kick off again, whenever you want.
Okay, so I think we finished the near-term planning. So what's up next? Oh, okay, so this is probably some of the interesting stuff. So planning apps and tools. So I've just done a couple of screen prints of the stuff that I use most of all on my mobile phone. If you only used one app, I would recommend PhotoPills. So I'll go into that in a little bit more deeper dive. I've also become absolutely hooked on something called Gaia, which is this little image down here. So I'll switch on to my mobile in a little while and show you how to do that. That's about not so much location scouting, but location tracking. But the type of things that I tend to use my apps for to supplement the desktop planning I've done is Moon. So I tend to use Moon Plus. It's just a really simple app that allows me to see when the new moons are and the different phases and moonrise, moonset. Weather is a hot topic. Everyone has their own favorite weather app. The ones I tend to use in particular is something called Weather Radar. It's actually more of a site/app than a true app. It's a German-based one, but it's really good for figuring out what cloud cover is going to be. It's real time, but you can also see what the next 3 days are going to look like. And by and large, I found it pretty accurate. It has let me down once, so I can't say, I used to be able to say it's never let me down, but it did. And actually it did in Glencoe Locken, which is the case study that I'm going to walk us through in a little while. Aurora, I like the Aurora forecast. There are a few others, but that's the main one that I tend to use. When it comes to weather, actually, I'll show you a little bit about Starcaster. So Starcaster, I've been beta testing for about 18 months now. I think it's almost close to being in full general release. But once I show you anyone that's interested, all you have to do is message them on their Facebook page and they'll normally send you a link and invite you to be a beta tester. So that's becoming a hot favorite of mine, I have to say, for weather when it gets to near-term planning. And then things like my tide times. The other things I guess in here that's worthwhile calling out is, I don't know if anyone has used things like Investigator. There's loads of different types of these kind of apps around, but what I use Investigator for is whenever I go to location, and certainly when I'm doing my recceing in person, I'll take reference photos. And what Investigator can do is get the GPS out the back of it. So as long as you've taken a photo with your phone and you have GPS enabled, you can go back at any time with Investigator and work out exactly where it is and go back and use GPS to find it on a map, which I think is really helpful. It's kind of been superseded a little bit with my use of Gaia, but that's only if you know you're going to want to go back that you'll use Gaia. So let me do a little bit more of an explanation of a couple of those. So if you only use one app tip is PhotoPills. I don't know how many people are used to PhotoPills. I was using it a lot way before I got into astro for sunrise, sunset planning, which I think it's absolutely really brilliant for. Planning wise, it's good for using for Milky Way positioning. So when you're doing your desktop planning or your mobile phone planning, you can do it there. But it's also got the most amazing night AR capability when you're on location. So I'll show you a little bit about that. And in fact, yes, if I take you through, and then partway through this, what I'll do is I'll switch to my mobile phone and show you some of these apps and show you how I used it. My planning MO, so as a case study, how's it work? So at the beginning of the year, I'll do my desktop planning, so I'll know exactly when in which months I'm going to go out and try and catch the Milky Way, because that's the one that I need to be most careful about. I'll normally, if I can, go and do a physical recce. And that's because desktop planning, like landscape photography, can only get you so far. And I want to understand the terrain. And when I'm there doing the physical recce, the things I tend to do is I'll use PhotoPills to do the night AR, work out exactly what compositions I like, what months they're best for, what time of the night they're best for, because you can get about 60, 70% of the way there when you're just doing it on the PhotoPills app before you ever set foot on location. But actually, I found if I do get a chance to go there in person, then the chances of success are, astronomically better. I then use this Gaia tracker. So effectively, what that does, it's a bit like it's used for hikers. So you can track where you're walking, you can drop pins along the way, you can affix photographs. And the reason for me that's important is, you might think it's going to be easy to go and get that photo when you've recorded it in daylight and it looks nice and easy. But you try doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning in the pitch black with Scottish bogs and lochs and, umpteen different things that you can fall down and hurt yourself on. So actually I found if I use the Gaia, once I've worked out where I want to take my photo, I'll probably set another set of tracking going and head my way back in the most optimum route back to the car or wherever the safe place is, so that when I turn up there at night time, all I have to do is turn this back on and I can use it to track my way back to location. It also works if you've not got GPS, which is a really important thing, because PhotoPills, you need to make sure you have opened it for the geographical area you want to use it before you get on location if it's in a black spot. So that's one of the things that's worthwhile knowing, is just have a quick look at your plans before you head out into what could be a complete black zone for photos, and then it's going to respond well. So having done the physical recce, I'll monitor the weather. Quite often I will cry when, not literally cry, but I could feel like I could cry when weather stops play, and you're in that kind of lather, rinse, repeat scenario of just waiting for the composition that you've been planning to actually come good. Obviously you arrive on location, you hope it's EEP, you hope the weather's going to hold up, you hope people aren't going to suddenly turn up and ruin all your photos with headlamps, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then you get onto the capture side of things. And what I'm going to do is I will show you how I went about planning for my Glencoe Locken example. So to do that, I just need to do a couple of things. So mobile phone, I've got to turn my Wi-Fi back on. I decided to go onto Ethernet for tonight to try and make sure that I could have a good connection and not keep falling in and out. So bear with me while I do that. Hopefully it's going to find my Wi-Fi. And there we go. Right. So while I'm doing this, has anyone else got any questions?
I've unmuted everyone so you can ask any questions.
Hello.
Hi. So I tested this earlier and it was working, but it's just struggling a little bit now, so bear with me.
Vikki, see when you arrive at your location, are you sort of side of the road photography, or is there some walking involved?
For me, there's normally some walking involved. I mean, it's great if it's side of the road. So there are some locations that can be. So someone can tell me how I should pronounce it, but I call it Loch Otriatoshen. And I know that's not how you pronounce it, but in Glencoe, that's right by the roadside, which is fabulous. But no, quite often it's either hiking up a mountain or going down beside a water. But, you know, whatever the picture demands, I guess. Yeah. And actually sometimes the harder to approach ones are the nicer ones, because it means not everyone else has got them. So that's another draw for me.
So how do you kit yourself out clothing wise for these wee adventures?
So it depends on where it is. So my general setup is I have photography clothes that I use anyway. So that tends to be hiking trousers, hiking boots. I tend to go for layers. I now have quite a good set of down so that I can do the layers and keep warm. I normally have waterproofs over the top of where my trousers are. I also have down trousers now, because when I sat by Kilchurn, that was so cold, it was unbelievable. And then of course when I was in Canada earlier this year, it was a whole heap of different things required. So yeah, I've got a lot of different bits and pieces now, but you know, hats, gloves, mittens, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So for some reason this doesn't want to let me do try it again.
Vikki?
Yep.
Have you heard of a body warmer that's got a power pack on it that keeps you warm?
I have, and I've got one. I've got one because I use it for my motorbike. So I've got a heated gilet. So
Brilliant.
it is brilliant actually. So for me, I can plug it straight into my motorbike, which is wonderful. But I've also got a small battery pack that you put inside the pocket, and that was the envy of pretty much everyone when we were in minus 43 degrees in January. Right, okay, can everyone see my mobile phone? Let's hope I don't get anything untoward coming on. Right, so the things I was going to show you, let me get rid of some of these. Right, so Gaia. So if I just show you Gaia very briefly, so you can see, for example, if I look at Glencoe, I've got a number of different places that I've recce'd, and this will show you the type of things you can do. So Glencoe Lochen for this photo here, for anyone that's interested, it's dead easy to find because it's literally, if I go into the map, it's literally just you park in the normal car park and you head on the right hand side all the way down to the end of the loch, and then that's the viewpoint that you'd want coming back. And these little, you know, kind of spots you've got on here are, as I've walked around, I've taken photos, reference photos, to work out what I think I wanted to take just with my iPhone. And it's absolutely fabulous because effectively, when you end up on location, you can just turn up at the car park and press guide me. So effectively, if I were to go back to this one, I can literally just say guide me. And clearly it's getting its knickers in a twist here, but it will normally allow you to figure out where you want to go. And I've used it in all sorts of different countries, and it's also great if you're just out wandering and you're not sure what you're going to find. You can have different locations. So for me, you might find that I'll have composition number 1, 2, or 3. So I can have ones that I prefer more than others, because when you get there, you might find something's impeding that view, for example, which I definitely had when I arrived at Glencoe Lochen here. A lot of the water had gone, and there was a whole load of building works going on. So I would definitely recommend something like Gaia. I've also used it when I'm finding my way back. So in Death Valley, I'd been with a whole load of friends. I finally found a good composition, but the timing wasn't right. So I decided to drive back via Death Valley when I was coming from the Sierras on the way to catch my flight, because I didn't get a composition I was really happy with the right weather conditions. So I got up at 2 a.m. and drove all the way back there and used Gaia to find my way because it's a black spot. It's about a 45-minute hike from the road. You have to do it in the pitch black to find it. And if I hadn't been using Gaia, I would never have been able to find my way back to that little patch of mud cracks that I liked the look of and wanted to try and get for sunrise. So that's what I will do as part of the planning. So that's Gaia. What other things? I'll actually come back to PhotoPills because that's the more complicated one in a minute. So Starcaster. So this is one that I mentioned that I now use for a lot of my weather in near terms. And you can set up a whole load of areas. So Stonehaven is where I took May and Janet and another friend of ours when I was teaching them Astro a couple of years ago. And I've wanted to go back since because I didn't get a photo that I was actually happy with myself. I was hoping to go back, but COVID has stopped us. April is the best month. So March or April are two good compositions. So effectively the way Starcaster works is you can see this one is Stonehaven. So you can scroll through and see for the upcoming days what the likely astro conditions are going to be like. And, you know, effectively here it's starting to say 11 o'clock on Saturday would actually be pretty good. And it's taking into account the cloud cover in particular as to whether that's going to be good. And it takes a little bit of account of moonlight, but not too much. So for example, for April, when I would have gone last weekend, it was perfect conditions. It was the highest rating I've ever seen on Starcaster, and we were all stuck in lockdown. And I was good. So, but I do use this because it gives you a good idea of what's going on. And you can quickly swipe between, so Portnocky, I've been there once or twice and again had bad cloud cover when I got there when they were due for aurora. And it tends to be one of the ones that doesn't have great opportunities. But again, for Saturday, it's not that far from Donata, so unsurprisingly, it's good. So you can just kind of scroll through and see of your favoured areas, which one looks like there's any good astro conditions coming up. And then you can just keep an eye on them as you get through. So I'm really starting to like this because usability wise, it is so easy. It stops me needing to go into way too many different apps. If I were to show you weather radar, so that was the one I mentioned otherwise because I do still use it. So effectively I'd be saying Stonehaven, for example. If I go into the weather map here, you can see what the clouds looking like. And across the bottom here, you can see now, today, tomorrow, Saturday. And if I were to look at tomorrow and press the play button, you'll be able to see how the clouds like to move. And obviously the snow and the rain and what have you. And it's really been quite accurate. So where I took that astro shot in Torridon, we were up in Aberdeen. We've been planning to do 3-night shooting, all nighttime shooting around there, and we were completely cloud banked. And there was so much snow that the majority of the roads were being closed as well. So we used this particular app to try and find a tiny hole in the clouds. And we realized that we could drive all the way over to Torridon, and there was about an hour that was predicted to have one hole in the cloud, and it took us something like 5 hours to drive it in the snow conditions. But when we got there, it was beautiful, and we suddenly had, for literally about 5 or 10 minutes, it wasn't long, we had the aurora turn up as well. So I kind of swear by this. Loads of other people use different things. I think cloudy outside is another one that people use, clear outside. I happen to think one of our other club members use a lot. But for me, they're the ones that I use most of all. It's a bit painful when you see an alert coming up saying Starcaster says the weather conditions are perfect for astro when you can't go out. So that's the only downside. So those two. Now, if I go on to PhotoPills. So I'll come back and talk about this later. I've left it open on the screen so that I don't forget to. But effectively, when it comes to choosing how long your settings, your aperture should be open, your shutter speed should be open. There's two different ways of doing it. So there's a handy part of the app in here. So if I go back to the main area, if you go into this spot stars on the right hand side, you can actually set up your camera. So for example, I've got my 3 most commonly used cameras set up on here, and it actually understands what's going to work for that camera. You set up the millimeter. For those of you that don't know, the wider aperture you use, the shorter time you're going to be able to keep it open for. No, sorry, wrong way around. The longer you're going to be able to leave it open for, because when I was at 24mm, for example, it was different, because you start getting what they call coma. So where the Earth's rotation is such, you get a star trail and it looks like a bit of a comma. So there's all sorts of rules. There's a 500 rule, and the 500 rule on my Sony, for example, would say I should be able to take a photo for 28 seconds. Now I know I can't do 28 seconds without having a really bad coma. If I don't mind almost imperceptible tails, then it says 12.4 seconds should be fine. And this is set up for 18mm for me because I've got a lens that happens to be 18mm. But if you want to print it and you really care about how tiny the stars are, then this allows you to go into truly accurate. So for my latest camera on my favorite astro lens, actually I should be taking it about 6 seconds, which is a bit of a mind blow for me because I'm used to thinking as long as I go for about 20 seconds, I should be fine. But if I'm going to want to start printing and doing it large scale, then I'm going to need to do the smaller amounts. But the majority of people will be happy doing it at the slightly longer length. So that's handy for people if they want to know what kind of size and what kind of settings to use. But how I use most of this is twofold. Firstly, in the planner. So here across the top of PhotoPills is like a scrolling bar, and that helps you decide what you're actually trying to do with it. And once you've got it set, the likelihood is you don't tend to change it, but it's easier to explain to people when you're there. So for me, for example, I like to be able to see the Milky Way, so I just touch that icon on the top left hand side. At the bottom here, you'll see if I scroll along, that's the timeline. So in daytime, the reason people use this for sunrise and sunset is you can see when golden hour is, you can see exactly where the sun's going to rise. You go through daytime, then you get sunset, and then you go into nighttime. And you'll see there's different colors. So that's kind of blue hour, and then astronomical twilight, which is the kind of bluer, and then you'll suddenly see it goes really clear, which means you're now in it's dark enough to start taking night photographs. You'll see if I scroll along, that's the timeline. So in daytime, the reason people use this for sunrise and sunset is you can see when golden hour is, you can see exactly where the sun's going to rise. You go to daytime, then you get sunset, and then you go into nighttime. And you'll see there's different colours. So that's kind of blue hour. And then you playing Stuart twilight, which is kind of bluer. I can hear myself back. I assume everyone else can as well. There you go. Okay. So that was quite bizarre. I thought I was asking myself a question. Right. So the dots are the Milky Way, and the rings tell you how high up in the sky it's going to be. So this allows you to start working out what your compositions might look like. And this is actually in Blencoe because I saved a plan. So I created a plan. You can see I've got quite a few here. And the first time it would have been visible was in August. So on the bottom right hand side, you can see the date there. So that's when I started doing my planning to work out what you could do. So that's the first way you use it. The next thing that you tend to do is you can see at the bottom there's night AR. So if I try this, what that allows me to do is I can turn around and you can kind of see where the Milky Way is going to be in any given period of time. And that's still showing for August at 12:15. So I can stand there and literally take a picture or a screen print of here of my own composition and where the Milky Way will be at any given time. And again, I can just move my finger to and fro to change the timing to be able to figure out when I'd want that to be. So I'll come back out of there. What else can I show you on here? Oh, actually, yes. So if I were to look at the night AR again now, all those bands that you see, if I move up, you see that kind of circle in the middle, that's the North Star, that's Polaris. So if you're going to do star trails, you can work out your composition. So some of the funky ones where it's going in swirls around a tree, for example, the one I showed earlier, I should probably put that on airplane mode, then you can see exactly where that composition will be as well. And then when you're looking elsewhere, you can see what the star trails would be doing for any given composition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really
Yep.
clear.
So yeah, so if you only used one thing, it would definitely be that. The other things I can talk about is if you swipe at the top, you can actually see in the top left-hand side, that thing that just looks like a murky white blob in black. That's the position of the Milky Way. So again, you can see how it's going to change. So for now, it is kind of that slightly horizontal vision, whereas if I were to jump forward, then you can start seeing it becomes a lot more vertical. And by tapping that image as well, I don't want to overload people, by tapping it one, it jumps forward to the next kind of point at which you might be able to, and you tap it twice. So you can also use that to be able to jump to new moons and jump to astro opportunities without having to go and look at it on a calendar. So that's generally how I tend to use PhotoPills. So I will go to a location, I will set up, do my night AR, figure out what composition looks like, take a screen print, go to the next month, and in the top left hand side I'll be able to see exactly what time I'd need to be there for. And if I were to show you how I did that, so I can now go back to a new share, bear with me, go back to my desktop. I tend to use something called Evernote. Stop sharing that as well. Cool. So what you can see I did in this particular case study is I went there and saw it. I could take a screen print, so I could see, oh, you can't see that, can you?
Yeah, we're still getting your phone.
Yeah, no, let me just move you back then.
There we go.
So you can see that. Right. So I was there in September, so I could see that in September it would align here. This orange blob is the core of the Milky Way, so it allows you to see how much of that core you're going to be able to get in your actual photo. I can see that it would be 9 o'clock. That would be the kind of time that I'd want to be there. So I can keep a note saying we'll get there for 8 because the optimum time for it to be above the Pap of Glencoe would be between 9 and 10 if I were to go in September. I wanted to go in September, weather was rotten, so I couldn't. So luckily enough, I'd also worked out what it might look like in October and November. So it's exactly the same thing. It's just a way of being able to say, right, okay, for those months, it gets earlier in the evening, so you don't have to stay up as late, but the core drops lower, so I'm not going to see as much Milky Way. And then you can get, if you're really ambitious like me, you start thinking about all the other places that you might want to do in Glencoe, what the different, so this is literally just something I created for myself that weekend, what months for what compositions might work, and then you sit and go and do a timeline. So I worked out if I went in September, I could potentially get Glencoe between 8:30 and 10:30. I could go and do the Buckle between midnight and 1. And if that didn't work out, I could go to the Three Sisters. So I'm a bit of a planner. So that's what works quite well for me. And over all of those, I only got the one image because the weather didn't play ball for any of the others. So, and I count myself lucky that I managed to get that one last year, which allows me to then go back to Prezi. So, move those out of the way. So what I did manage to get on the October date that I went was this. So when I'm there, I do tend to take the 2 cameras out so that I can take a time lapse. I really love the movement. It goes back to the type of things that I really like. It gives me a sense of how I felt to be there at the time. But the other thing that works quite well is effectively in that particular time lapse, you may not have noticed, but when it comes to a still image, the best one, I didn't really want to do that, sorry. Wait for it to go. You'll see all the clouds are coming in, so I ended up stopping it earlier than I would have done because there were just so many clouds by the time it got to that optimum right in the middle of the mountain, which meant I could luckily just go and take one of the images and turn that into a still. So although I was spending time doing lots of them, this was the image that I liked most of all, and it was almost still in astronomical twilight, so it wasn't as dark as I would have liked. It was very blue, but it was the best picture that I saw. So by taking time lapses, you can either turn it into a star trail, you can keep it as a time lapse, or you can get a still out of it. So that tends to be my standard MO now. Does that make sense? Because I know it well, I know it means I'm probably giving people more detail than they actually want. So that's the planning. Before I move on to shooting, any questions?
That takes you all that before you get to the shooting.
Sorry, say again?
Takes you all that before you get to the shooting.
Yes, exactly. And we were going to break, weren't we, so that we could do the processing. Is now a good time to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's as good a time as any. We'll have a break for the submissions for the challenges, yeah.
So it says shooting considerations. Excellent. Okay, so we're basically going to shooting, and I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can. And you can let me know.
It just says Vikki started screen sharing, but there's nothing on it, Vikki. Oh, that's it now.
All right, okay. You must have a delay to get to you, mate.
Okay. So the first thing I was going to talk about is actually etiquette. So I'll make this quite brief, but when you go and do astro, there's kind of a set of rules that most people abide by. And the two images you can see on here are kind of the reasons why you need to have some etiquette rules. So most people are happy to share space. They know other people are really interested in taking similar photographs, and quite often you'll be looking at the same subject matter as well. So you have to be able to work together. And the simple rules are: turn all your lights off, let your eyes get adjusted. Some people use red head torches to get to wherever they're going to start taking photos, but even then you have to be careful. So in the Glenlochan example I gave you, a couple of, let's say chaps, but it was a girl and a boy, walked the whole length of the loch with bright head torches on the whole way, which meant I had to crop out big chunks of my time lapse because they just had them on for about 20 minutes as they walked around. The other thing to bear in mind when you are there is just making sure you're all kind of shooting at the same time, so people understand that you might need to turn a head torch on or start playing with the back of your camera if you don't know how to use it properly at night time, because that's something to practice at home, so that you don't have to turn torches on. But you just ask everyone if anyone's open. So if you need to turn a torch on, you just call out and say, is anyone open? And they'll certainly let you know if they're taking a photograph. And then when everyone's stopped taking a photograph, which they will do at the next opportunity, you can do whatever you need to. So it might sound really simple and silly, but unless you follow those rules, you just ruin everyone else's photos, as you can see happened in these couples. So yeah, etiquette matters.
Just a matter of manners, isn't it?
Sorry, say again?
Just a matter of manners.
Yeah, no, it is, but you'd be surprised. And I've had the reverse happen. So I wanted to go out somewhere, and I was with someone and said, oh, we can't, there's other photographers there. And it's like, well, no, you're absolutely fine. As long as you abide by the normal etiquette rules, people are going to be absolutely happy.
Yeah.
Don't rock up with big lights on your head.
I've had that a few times. I've been up at the Kelpies, and the camera's been up, people just walk right in front of you, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. It is pure manners, really, isn't it?
I'm talking about photographers, not just talking to people.
Oh, they're even worse because they should know better.
Yeah.
So the type of techniques I was going to talk about is single exposures, multiple exposures, and by that I often mean blends. What I mean by blend is where you don't move your tripod or your camera. So effectively focus stacking, exposure blending, noise reduction stacking, or tracking, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But for me, a blend just means same position, same setting. So it could be blue hour and nighttime shooting, and you blend them together, or it could be the other things mentioned here. But that's the difference between a blend in my mind and a composite. And I do blends, but I don't do composites. I can appreciate composites, I can appreciate the art in them, but my personal values are such that I can't do that. It's not so much that it's cheating, it's just not what I do. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these, but I won't talk about composites because that's not my style. But the essence will still be true regardless. So settings. So this is what people are most often interested in knowing about. So I'll take you through a few of the numbers. So for single exposure images, it's really easy. You know, nighttime photography and stars is actually one of the easiest things to do because the settings are very basic. Focusing is something I probably should have put in the slides, but focusing again is fairly simple. You would normally use your live view on the back. You'll try and find the brightest star. You'll zoom in as much as you can, and then you'll manually focus. It's normally in infinity, but most lenses don't actually have infinity as infinity, so it's normally infinity and then cranks back a little bit. So once you've got into that habit using live view, it's dead easy. Aperture, just as fast as possible, so with wide open, 2.8 or lower is perfect. Shutter speed is open as long as possible without star trails. So we spoke about that earlier. Most people will say if you're 15-20 seconds is normally fairly safe to avoid comma if you're not worried about the absolute pin prick accuracy we talked about. And as low as you can go in ISO and still get the image that you want to. So I tend to try 3200. I know people that do 5000, 6000, 6400. 3200 tends to be my go-to because if you start going below that, unless you're doing loads and loads of stacking, then it's going to degrade in quality. So this image, for example, was ISO 5000, f2.8, and 20 seconds. And the reason I was actually at 5000 is we were light painting and it worked better. It just seemed to bring the colours out far better. So we had someone with their head torch basically wiping across all of those lavender fields. And then it's about experimenting with light painting. It's very much about experimenting, but you can get some really good results. So f2.8, about 20 seconds, ISO 3200, and the likelihood is as long as you're focused, you're going to get a pretty good single exposure image. The other single exposures I thought I should just mention briefly is Aurora, which is pretty much the same as normal nighttime photography, but quite often it needs to be shorter or a lower ISO because it's that much brighter. So this was the image I mentioned earlier in terms of it was so bright through those clouds that in that instance, I was doing it at 6 seconds and down at ISO 1600. And it's not blown any highlights, but that was all I needed to be able to try and get some of the green, and you can kind of just see some of the pillars going through the holes in the cloud. That's not a photo I would use anywhere, but for demonstrating purposes, I thought it was helpful to show. Whereas over here, the Torridon one, that was at 3200, f2.8, and actually for me, 13 seconds was the right amount of time to get the pillars and the movement going on. But by and large, you would just think 2 to 8 seconds is a good place to start for Aurora. Multiple exposures. Now this is when it starts to get a little bit more time consuming, especially when it comes to the processing. So I won't labour these for too long, but the reasons you would do them is focus stacking, as everyone knows, to try and get different images in focus, or exposure blending if you're trying to get the dynamic range in there. And that can be particularly true if you've got something with ambient light, or you are light painting, or you've got bright buildings going on. So this is actually just a simple blend for me. It's a foreground and sky taken in exactly the same spot and actually with the same settings, 3200, f2.8 for 20 seconds, but the foreground was done during blue hour. So that was kind of an evening blue hour, and we just sat there at Jigsaw Rocks and took those. And that was because I liked also 20 seconds was nice for the amount of water you could see. So that's a really simple blend. Then you've got the two very common other multiple exposures, which is stacking and tracking. So stacking for noise reduction. Again, I haven't really edited this photo. I decided not to use it. I was setting my time lapse up, which was the other camera. I moved away a little bit, and actually the time lapse ended up being the better picture for both still and for time lapse because you had the reflection going on. Whereas where I was a little bit further on the lake for this one, I didn't have the reflections as I would have liked it, so I've not edited it heavily. But what you can see here is this is stacked. So you'll see it looks like it's a really long exposure for the clouds going on. It's not, in fact, what that is where I've taken about 20 images and they're down at kind of f4 and 6 seconds. So this is where I mentioned you don't have to have an 2.8, you can do f4 and higher. And it only needed 6 seconds because I knew I was going to stack whole load. And by stacking them and then using software like Starry Landscape Stacker, it takes a lot of the noise out. So it doesn't matter that it's actually a much a much shorter exposure than you might think. And the clarity of these stars, I'm now seeing why people like doing the shorter ones, because they're so much crisper and sharper. But it does give you kind of that long exposure feeling as well, because of the clouds. When you put them all together, they kind of layer over each other. You can't unhide a cloud. So that's what stacking would be. Normally, you can use PhotoPills, as we said, to get the accurate stars. You can have a lower ISO if you want to, as long as you're over 10,000. I tend to stick exactly as is and just take 20. I used to take 5 or 6, but I've just found taking 20 now allows me to drop the shutter speed and get it much clearer. So that's stacking. And then the alternative to stacking is tracking. So I bought a tracker a couple of years ago, and I first got the chance to use it out in Death Valley. This is another Blue Owl blend. So the sky here was 2 minutes, 14mm at f2.8, and down at ISO 1600 because I was doing it for the 2 minutes. And this sky is barely processed. When I looked at it on the back of the camera, I was literally hopping for joy and excitement, because all of the colours of the nebula that people try and pull out in processing are literally there in front of your eyes in a single image for the sky. Of course, the thing with the tracker is it's following the Earth's rotation, which means your foreground is blurry. So you have to blend if you're going to do a tracked image. The downside of tracked images, I guess, is it's really time consuming to get set up, or at least mine was, to try and align it with the Earth's rotation, by which point I could probably have taken my 20 individual images and stacked those and got a very similar result. And I would have had a time lapse or a star trail if I wanted to. So that's tracking. And that's pretty much it for shooting, because I wanted to allow time for questions. But very quickly, the other thing I was going to do was just include some fails, and to let everyone, or reassure everyone that, you know, in your journey, there will be so many times when it won't work out. You know, whether it's you turn up to a place and you just get there too late, just as the Milky Way has decided it's going to hide, and you can't get it in the position you wanted. Whether you're doing a star trail, here I was in Joshua Tree with a friend. We went out, we set it all up, recreated that light, recreated the foreground. It was something he wanted to do, and we wanted to do a star trail. We set it going, we went and sat back in the car because it was freezing cold and there were coyotes completely howling around us. So it was quite eerie and a little bit scary. So we didn't want to be out there. We went and sat in the car. We made sure it was going when we left. When we got back an hour later to see how the pictures had gone, mine had taken 3 shots before my intervalometer failed. So it was after this trip, I went and got myself an upgrade, so I had an inbuilt intervalometer. That's just an example of another night where I decided to pull an all-nighter and it was just cloud bound, so you couldn't see any stars. Doing a long exposure foreground, and some arse decides he's going to drive down with headlights and completely bleach the shot that you just spent 7 minutes photographing, and you've got noise reduction turned on. So yeah, you know, there are plenty of times when you look at your photos, you'll have more misses than hits. But if you go back to my reason for doing it, part of the time it's just being out in the night and enjoying the results if I get them, then it's not too much of a problem. And that was it for me. So is there any questions, really?
You use bulb mode at all?
I do. So I do for my long exposure foregrounds. Quite often my foregrounds can be, and you shouldn't officially do this because it's not good for your sensors, 7, 8 or 9 minutes long. So that's when I'll use the bulb mode, or of course if I'm doing a tracked image that's going on for a couple of minutes. So I don't do it as much as I used to now that I do a lot of stacking rather than tracking.
Yeah.
But on occasion, I do it a lot for my landscape because I like extreme long exposure. But it's only for the foregrounds I tend to use bulb for in night photography.
Good.
So that's me.
Now,
Vikki, can I ask you, what's tracking?
So tracking is you buy a tracker and you attach it to the top of your tripod, but you have to get it facing the right star, Polaris generally, so that it's able to move in time with the Earth's rotation. So you take it doesn't look, you can't see it moving all that much, but it just means it can keep tracking on the stars rather than the foreground so that it's pin sharp.
Yeah, I understand this. Yeah.
So you don't get the tails off it then, basically, is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the detail, the colours, you know, it is beautiful what it gets as results. But I just found it a real faff, and it's quite heavy. So, you know, if I'm hiking in the dark for 45 minutes across uneven terrain, suddenly putting, you know, the equivalent of a bag of sugar extra in my bag is quite a lot, especially if I might spend 20 minutes setting it up, take my first photo and find I haven't quite aligned it properly. So I'm sure I know there are people that use theirs all the time and swear by them, but I'm just finding it's easier to stack rather than track.
You just swing it then. Swing
Yeah.
it.
Any more questions for Vikki? No, I
Who's going to go out and
certainly.
give it a try?